Hello and welcome to our second video on basic computer skills, and today we are going to be looking at operating systems. So I'm just going to talk about just the most common operating systems, and we have three of those, which is the Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. So I'm going to start with Linux and we'll work our way back to Windows. So Linux is the third most common operating system in use. It was developed by a guy by the name of Linus Torvalds, and it is open source. What that means is everyone can view the source code and contribute, make modifications to the code. There's actually several different varieties of Linux out there. So our second most common operating system is the Mac OS, and of course it is developed by Apple. And then we have Windows. It is the most common operating system in use, and it has been developed by Microsoft. And Windows is going to be the operating system we focus on primarily for the remainder of our videos in this basic computer series. So I kind of want to go over a brief history of Windows. So it started out with Windows 1.0, released back in November 20th of 1985. I'm not going to read out all the dates for you. You can read these off the screen. But then we had, a couple years later, Windows 2.0, then followed about 2.5 years later after that by Windows 3.0 and Windows 3.1. And I'm basically naming off here the major iterations of Windows, and there were subsequent smaller iterative updates in between these various versions. But I just want to kind of hit the highlights, and this will kind of lead into our next kind of topic about the operating systems once we kind of finish covering here. So then of course Windows 3.1 and then Windows NT 3.x. Then we had Windows 95, Windows NT 4.0, Windows 98, Windows 2000, Windows ME. To make some distinction here, some of these operating systems were designed more for business use than they were for home use. So for example, Windows 2000, Windows NT, those I believe had more of a business-centered focus, whereas like your Windows ME, that was purely more of a home base for home users. It was the target market. So then we kind of get more to the modern operating systems of the for Windows that everyone is most familiar with, starting with Windows XP that came out in the late 2001. Then we had Windows Vista 7, 8, and 8.1, and then the current OS, Windows 10. So as I mentioned earlier, why it's important to kind of know the dates of when they release, because Windows has what they call the support lifecycle on their operating systems. So from the date they release, they have a certain window of when they'd be available for purchase, and then a certain deadline as to when they would kind of sunset the OS and terminate support. And then depending on what version you get, you may get some additional time based on that. So this is important to know, and I have a link here that you can go to and kind of get some more detailed information, but I just want to give you just the very basics here. Don't want to overload you with too much, but that's why I have the link there you can type into your browser and look at after finishing this video. So the one distinction I do want to make with starting with Windows 10, Microsoft has changed how they've doing their Windows updates. They are now doing like twice yearly kind of major updates to their OS, and each of those versions have their own kind of time frame of, again, support and when they'll be essentially retired, and that's all referenced on the page. So again, it's very important to make sure when those updates are coming out, you don't necessarily have to update right away if you're concerned about it being buggy, but you definitely want to make sure you're keeping up with those updates so you have the latest security patches, and that way you have covered support for Microsoft in terms of system updates. So that is pretty much it for talking about operating systems, just a brief overview. And in our next video, we are actually going to start looking at the various Windows components.